Jedediah Croft stood on her doorstep, his hat held like a shield against his chest. The cracked leather was dark with the sweat of his hands. Behind him, the August sky was not blue but a sheet of hammered brass, and the air tasted of dust. His own fields, the ones he kept scraped clean to the fence rows, were the color of old bone. The silence from his own apiary, he'd said, was the most terrifying sound he had ever known. Now he stood before the woman he and the rest of the valley had called the Weed Witch, and asked to rent her bees. He needed them for his last-ditch squash, the only thing that had survived the heat in the low, damp corner of his property. He looked at her, his proud farmer's face collapsing into a plea, and Clara saw not the man who had mocked her, but a man watching his world turn to powder. It had not always been this way. 2 springs earlier, Clara had arrived in the valley with little more than a deed to a plot of land everyone considered cursed and a stubborn set to her jaw. The place had belonged to a great aunt she'd never met, a woman remembered only for her eccentricities. The soil was thin, sloped, and rocky, good for little more than holding the world together. The town of Promise, nestled in the valley floor, looked up at her plot on the high bench and shook their heads. A young woman alone, they murmured at the general store, the words carrying both pity and judgment. She'll be starved out by winter, Jedediah Croft, whose immaculate fields of clover and alfalfa bordered her ragged property line, had been more direct. You'd do better to sell it for pennies and work in the town laundry, he'd advised, his voice thick with the certainty of a man whose family had farmed this land for 3 generations. Clara had just nodded, her hands already mapping the work in her mind. Her first act was to buy 3 hives of bees. This was seen as a forgivable, if foolish, extravagance. A little honey for her tea, perhaps, but then came the true madness. Instead of buying alfalfa seed or vegetable starts, she spent the last of her inheritance on burlap sacks filled with what the seed merchant called Wildflower mix. He'd sold it to her with a shrug, as if unloading a burden. She took the sacks in a bucket and began to walk. She scattered the seeds along the dusty verges of the road leading to her property. She tossed them into the eroded ditches and the barren patches where nothing but thistle would grow. She climbed the rocky outcrops and let the wind carry the fine, dust-like seeds across the unplantable slopes. Croft had watched her from his fence line, his arms crossed. "You're planting weeds, girl," he'd called out, not unkindly. "You'll have the whole county board on you for letting your ditches go to ruin." Clara had just raised a hand in acknowledgement and kept walking, her arms swinging in a steady rhythm, casting promises only she could see onto the scorned and broken ground. She worked until her hands were raw and the sun had fallen behind the western ridge, leaving the sky a tender, bruised purple. That night, she sat on her porch and did the arithmetic of survival. 3 hives, a handful of savings, a pantry with only staples. Against that, she tallied the immeasurable, the millions of tiny seeds now sleeping in the dirt, waiting for the spring rain. It was a fool's equation, and the whole town knew it. By June, the town's judgment had settled into a kind of gentle, ongoing mockery. Her ditches were not the neat, scraped-bare channels of her neighbors. They were shaggy with the green of new growth, a chaotic tapestry of unfamiliar leaves. When she came to town for supplies, folks would ask, "How's the weed farm, Clara?" And she would offer a small, quiet smile that gave them nothing. She spent her days with her bees. She learned their moods, the intricate dance language that told of nectar sources, the low, contented hum of a healthy hive versus the high-strung buzz of distress. She rose before the sun, her first thought always for the quality of the light, the feel of the air. She hauled water in 2 heavy buckets from the well, her shoulders aching, to nurse the most promising patches of seedlings through the dry spells. The work was methodical, rhythmic. Day after day of it smoothed the worry from her mind, leaving only the task at hand. One afternoon, a stooped figure made its way slowly up her lane. It was Anya Petrova, her nearest neighbor to the east, an old woman who had come from a country of harsh winters and deep forests. Anya's own small plot was a riot of strange vegetables and herbs the townsfolk found suspect. She carried a steaming cup in a steady, age-spotted hand. Clara stopped her work, wiping her brow with the back of a dusty glove. "They say you are planting madness," Anya said, her voice a low, gravelly rumble, accented and warm. She gestured with her chin at the burgeoning life in the ditch. "I say you are planting memory." She handed the cup to Clara. It was a fragrant, unfamiliar tea. In my country, Anya went on, her eyes scanning the mix of plants. A farmer who has only one crop is a farmer who is one hailstorm from begging. A field of one thing is a promise easily broken. 100 different flowers, that is a promise that keeps. Clara took a sip of the tea. It tasted of mint and something wilder, a flavor like sunshine on stone. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a fissure in her loneliness, a sense of being seen. Anya pointed a gnarled finger at a patch of lacy leaves. Queen Anne's lace. The bees love her. That one, the blue one, chicory. She has a deep root. She will drink when the clover has already turned to dust. Over the next weeks, Anya became her teacher. She taught Clara which plants the bees favored not just for the sweetness of their nectar, but for the richness of their pollen. She showed her how to read the sky for rain, not with hope, but with the clear-eyed assessment of a survivor. She spoke of the land not as a thing to be conquered, but as a partner to be coaxed and listened to. Clara learned to identify the deep-rooted perennials, the ones Anya called the anchors borage and comfrey, ironweed, and aster. While the other farmers cultivated their shallow-rooted, thirsty clover, Clara cherished these tough, resilient natives. She worked with a renewed sense of purpose, her solitude no longer feeling like isolation, but like a quiet, focused apprenticeship. The mockery from the town continued, but it felt distant now, irrelevant as the buzzing of flies. She was tending not weeds, but a promise. And as the summer wore on, that promise began to whisper back to her in the contented hum of her growing apiary. The first year was a year of settling in. The wildflowers were not a miracle, they were a project. Some patches thrived, others withered. Clara learned the language of her land's thirst, where the morning dew settled longest, which slopes held the afternoon sun like a curse. And through it all, she worked. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong, the nails permanently underlined with dirt. She learned the heft of a full frame of honeycomb, the delicate art of splitting a thriving hive to create a new one. Her 3 hives became 5, then 7. She kept to herself, her world shrinking to the borders of her property, to the flight paths of her bees and the slow, steady arc of the sun. It was in the second spring that the change began. The seeds she had scattered, the roots that had spent a year digging deep, awoke with a vengeance. Her ditches did not just bloom, they exploded. From the dusty roadside emerged a riot of color, blue chicory, purple thistle, the sunny, impertinent faces of black-eyed Susans, and the delicate white froth of Queen Anne's lace. It was not the tidy, uniform beauty of a flower-bed. It was wild, chaotic, and breathtakingly alive. The air on her land was different from the air in the valley. It was thicker, humming with a million tiny wings, sweet with the complex perfume of 100 different nectars. The town noticed, of course. Wagons slowed as they passed her property. The laughter had a different edge to it now, a note of confusion. Looks like the weeds won, a farmer might say, but the certainty was gone from his voice. It was a spectacle, a curiosity, but still, in their minds, useless. That summer, she met Finn. He was a boy from the town, maybe 12 years old, with hair the color of straw and eyes that seemed to be watching something no one else could see. The other boys his age were already taking on the swagger of their fathers, learning to hunt and farm. Finn preferred to wander, and his wanderings often led him up the road to Alara's land. He would stand at the edge of the property, half hidden by a stand of blooming milkweed, and just watch. He watched the bees, the iridescent shimmer of their wings, the way they moved from flower to flower with such frantic purpose. Clara, cautious by nature and habit, watched him back. She saw he never harmed anything. He never threw stones or swatted at the bees. One hot afternoon, she was inspecting a hive near the road when he finally got up the courage to speak. "What are their names?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara turned, surprised. "The bees don't have names, Finn, not all of them," he said, stepping closer. "The queens. They should have names." Clara looked at the boy's earnest face and saw a flicker of her own younger self, the part that saw a story in everything. She pulled out a frame, heavy and dripping with honey, crawling with workers. With a gentle finger, she pointed to the single, larger bee, her abdomen elongated, her movements more deliberate. "This is the queen of this hive," she said. Finn stared, mesmerized. "She looks like a queen. She should be called Aurelia." A smile touched Alara's lips, the first genuine, unguarded smile she'd offered to anyone from the town besides Anya. "Aurelio it is," she said. From that day on, Finn became a fixture on the farm. He wasn't strong enough for the heavy hauling, but he was patient and observant. He learned to spot the signs of a hive preparing to swarm, to recognize the different pollens the bees brought back on their legs, bright orange from poppies, pale yellow from the evening primrose. He gave every queen a grand, sonorous name: Beatrice, Cordelia, Isolde. He humanized the flock for her, his gentle situational irony. These tiny, fierce creatures given the comic dignity of royal titles, making the long days of labor feel lighter. He was her first convert, the first person to see her farm not as a field of weeds, but as a kingdom. That fall, Clara performed her first major harvest. Basket after basket of honeycomb came out of the hives, each frame a heavy, wax-sealed treasure. The honey was nothing like the pale, one-note clover honey that was the standard in the valley. Hers was a spectrum of colors and flavors. The spring honey was light gold, tasting of fruit blossoms and wild mint. The summer honey was a deep, rich amber, with notes of thistle and sun-baked earth. It was complex, wild, and utterly unique. She spent weeks in her small kitchen, the air thick with the scent of melting wax and warm honey. With a hand-cranked extractor, she spun the honey from the combs, the golden liquid pouring into waiting buckets. She rendered the wax into clean, fragrant cakes. And she did the arithmetic. Jar after jar was filled and sealed. She counted them in the evenings by lamplight, lining them up on her shelves. It was more than enough to see her through the winter. It was enough to buy more hives, more jars, perhaps even a small plot of adjoining land that was for sale. It was proof. Tangible, edible, golden proof. She had done it. She had taken a worthless piece of land and a scorned idea and spun them into sustenance. She kept her success secret, banking it like a coal low under ash. She sold a few jars at the general store, enough for her own supplies, but kept the bulk of her harvest hidden in her cellar. The townspeople who bought it were surprised. Funny taste, they'd say, accustomed to the bland sweetness of monoculture honey. But, not bad, they still didn't understand. They saw a few jars on a shelf, not the deep reserves in her cellar. They saw a woman scraping by, not a farmer who had just secured her future. One person alone, they had said, could never make it work. But she was not alone. She had Anya's wisdom, Finn's companionship, and an army of 100,000 loyal subjects, each one working for the good of the kingdom. The victory was private, but it was absolute. It settled in her bones, a quiet confidence that straightened her spine and calmed her hands. She met the lingering mockery with a stillness they could not penetrate. Being right was its own kind of reply. She did not need to voice it. The land was doing it for her, in a language of color and scent and the ever-present hum of thriving life. She knew a change was coming. The world was not yet ready to see what she had built, but soon, it would have no choice. Her first true test came not from the valley, but from the city. On a trip to the larger market town of Sterling, 30 miles away, she set up a small table with a dozen jars of her deep amber summer honey. Most shoppers, accustomed to the familiar local brands, walked past. But then a woman stopped, dressed in the crisp white uniform of a professional baker. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, took in the unusual color of the honey. "May I have a taste?" she asked, her voice clipped and professional. Clara offered a small wooden spoon dipped in the jar. The woman tasted it, and her face, which had been a mask of polite interest, transformed. Her eyes closed for a moment. "My heavens," she breathed. "What is this?" "It's honey," Clara said simply. "No," the woman corrected, her eyes snapping open, alive with discovery. "This is not just honey. This is the prairie in a jar. I can taste the sun, the wild rose, the thistle. Where does this come from?" Clara explained about her plot, her wildflowers. The baker listened, nodding, a slow smile spreading across her face. She was the head pastry chef for the Grand Excelsior Hotel in the capital, a place of unimaginable luxury. "I will buy all of it," she declared, gesturing to the table. "And I will place an order for 10 gallons more. Delivered by the 1st of next month." Clara stared at her. 10 gallons was more than she had ever imagined selling at once. It was a fortune. She did the quick arithmetic in her head. It was possible. "I can do that," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. The news of the sale traveled faster than Clara did. By the time she returned to Promise, the story was already legend, embellished and distorted. The woman from the city had paid a king's ransom. Alara was secretly rich. The whispers followed her through the general store, no longer mockery, but a new sound, envy. And with envy came its shadow. A few days later, a handsome carriage pulled up her lane. Out stepped a man in a fine wool suit, Mr. Silas Blackwood. He was the regional agent for a large grain consortium, a man who bought harvests and held mortgages, a man whose warmth was as polished and false as the shine on his boots. He surveyed her wild-looking property with a condescending smile. "Miss Alara," he began, his voice smooth as cream. "I've heard remarkable things. A true cottage industry. It's so admirable, what you've managed to do here, all by yourself." He walked toward a hive, then stopped at a safe distance. "I am in a position to help you. My company can take your entire production. All of it. We'll offer you a single, stable price. No more trips to market, no more uncertainty. We can make you a wealthy young woman." He named a price. It was a lowball offer, barely more than what the local farmers got for their bland clover honey. He was counting on her being ignorant, a simple country girl dazzled by a man in a suit. He saw her as a weakness to be exploited. Alara looked at him, her expression calm. She thought of the baker's face, the moment of pure, unadulterated delight. She thought of the complex flavor born of 100 different flowers. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone plain and factual. "But my price is higher." She named the price the baker had paid. Blackwood's smile tightened. The false warmth in his eyes turned to a cold, reptilian gleam. "That's ambitious," he said. "A thing is only worth what others will pay, Miss Alara. A single hotel chef does not make a market." "She does for me," Alara replied. He tipped his hat, the gesture sharp and dismissive. "A woman alone can't build a business on a single buyer. When you're ready to be realistic, you know where to find me." He departed in a cloud of dust and disapproval, leaving behind the clear, unspoken threat. He was a man who was not used to being told no. He had revealed himself. The town might have been skeptical, but Blackwood was the first true antagonist, the first person who wanted not just to dismiss her success, but to seize it. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The gentle heat of July curdled into a relentless, baking oppression. The sky, which had been a soft, hazy blue, turned to a hard, white glare. And the rain simply stopped. At first, the farmers of promise were not concerned. Dry spells were a part of life. But a week passed, then 2, then 3. The creek that ran through the valley floor, usually a steady, gurgling presence, shrank to a series of stagnant pools connected by a trickle of mud. The deep green of the clover and alfalfa fields faded to a sickly yellow-green, then to a brittle, uniform tan. The crops the valley depended on, the crops with their shallow, pampered roots, were dying of thirst. The land itself began to change. Cracks appeared in the fields, deep fissures that looked like wounds. A constant haze of dust hung in the air, coating every surface, turning the sunsets a fierce, apocalyptic red. The familiar sounds of the valley faded. The birds grew quiet. The lowing of cattle became more distressed. But the most profound silence came from the apiaries. The nectar flow, the great invisible river of sugar that fed the bees, had dried up. With no clover, no alfalfa, no garden flowers, the bees began to starve. Hives that had been bustling cities of tens of thousands of insects fell eerily quiet. Beekeepers would open their hives to find their colonies dwindling, the bees listless, the precious stores of honey being consumed just to survive. Panic began to set in. It started as a low murmur in the general store, then grew into a current of open fear. Men like Jedediah Croft, men who had seemed as permanent and unflappable as the hills themselves, now stood in tight, worried knots, their faces grim. Their entire year's profit, their survival, was tied to the health of their fields and the work of their bees. Now both were failing. The drought was a force of nature, an enemy you couldn't fight, an adversary that simply outlasted you. It had a personality, a cruel, indifferent character that pressed down on the valley day after day, week after week. Alara felt it too. The heat was a physical weight. The dust coated her tongue. Her own well level dropped. But her land was different. Her bees were different. In the mornings, when she walked her property, she saw that while some of her plants were suffering, the anchors, the ones Anya had pointed out, were holding on. The deep-rooted chicory was still producing its small, brave blue flowers. The prickly thistle, a menace to other farmers, was a lifeline for her bees, its purple blossoms buzzing with activity. The ironweed and goldenrod along the dampest parts of the ditches were still blooming, pulling on reserves of moisture the shallow-rooted crops could never reach. Her bees had to fly farther, work harder, but they had something to work for. Her ditches, the very symbol of her foolishness, had become an oasis in a rapidly expanding desert. The chaotic, weedy diversity that everyone had mocked was proving to be the deepest kind of resilience. She watched the sky, her heart tight with a mixture of fear and a strange, burgeoning vindication. The arithmetic she did now was not about profit, but about survival, and for the first time, her equation looked more promising than anyone else's. The great inversion happened slowly, then all at once. It was a change in perception, a fundamental reordering of value. For 2 years, the valley had operated on a simple truth. A clean, tidy field of a single, valuable crop was the sign of a good farmer. A messy ditch full of weeds was the sign of a fool. The drought burned that truth away. Now, Croft's immaculate clover fields were worthless tracts of brown dust. His fence rows, scraped bare out of pride, offered nothing. Alara's chaotic, blooming ditches, however, were an engine of survival. What had looked worthless was revealed to do the most. The mockery that had followed Alara for 2 years evaporated, replaced by a stunned, grudging silence. Neighbors who used to laugh as they passed her land now stared, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They saw the shimmer of life over her fields, heard the steady, powerful hum that was absent from the rest of the valley. They saw her bees, jewels of black and gold, returning to their hives with legs laden with pollen, and they could not comprehend it. It was as if she had made a deal with the drought itself. Hunger changes a town. With the failure of the cash crops and the collapse of the bee populations, the delicate economy of promise began to unravel. There would be no bumper crop of clover honey to sell. The squash and melon harvests, reliant on pollination, were failing. A grim austerity settled over the valley. And it is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. Whispers began to circulate, darker now than the simple mockery of before. She must have a secret spring. She was a water witch. The old talk of her being the weed which returned, but this time it was tinged not with humor, but with suspicion and fear. Jedediah Croft was the first to break. His pride, a formidable thing, had been eroded day by day as he watched his own hives die. He had 30 hives, the result of a lifetime of work, and 20 of them were already dead. The rest were starving. His last hope was a half-acre of squash planted in a low-lying patch near the shrunken creek, its broad leaves still miraculously green. But without bees to pollinate the blossoms, the plants would yield nothing. The flowers would bloom, then wither and fall, fruitless. He knew where the bees were. He could hear them from his own porch, a faint, taunting hum from the direction of Alara's land. For a week, he fought with himself. Then, one morning, with the sun already blazing in the brassy sky, he put on his hat and made the long walk up the hill. And so he stood on her porch, a man undone, asking for help from the one person he had been so sure was a fool. It was the moment the whole story had been building toward. Alara looked at him, at the desperation that had finally outweighed his pride. In his eyes, she saw the reflection of the entire valley, frightened, hungry, and wrong. She held all the power. She could have refused him. She could have named an exorbitant price, extracting a pound of flesh for every joke and every dismissive word. The silence stretched out, thick with the heat and the dust and the weight of 2 years of history. Silas Blackwood returned on the same day Croft came to call. He must have had scouts, informants who told him of the valley's plight and Alara's unique position. His carriage seemed even more offensively elegant amidst the pervasive dust. He found Alara on her porch, Croft still standing there, awaiting her verdict. Blackwood's eyes took in the scene, and a flicker of triumphant understanding crossed his face. He saw not a neighborly negotiation, but a transaction of desperation. "Miss Alara," he said, his voice oozing a predatory sympathy. "A difficult time for the valley. It seems your unusual methods have paid off. You find yourself in a commanding position." He turned his gaze on Croft, dismissing him as a piece of irrelevant scenery. "I've come to renew my offer. In fact, I'm prepared to be even more generous. I will buy every drop of honey you have. I'll pay you twice what I offered before. I'll take it all, and you won't have to deal with bargainers." The implication was clear. He would buy her entire stock, create a monopoly, and then sell the honey back to the desperate people of Promise and beyond, at whatever price the market would bear. He was offering her a partnership in his greed. He was offering her revenge. Before Alara could answer, Croft spoke, his voice rough. That's between her and me. Blackwood gave a short, sharp laugh. There's nothing between you, Croft. You have nothing she wants. I have cash. In a drought, that's the only thing that matters. He turned back to Alara. Think of it. You could buy his land. Once he defaults, you could own this whole side of the mountain. All you have to do is be smart. He was offering her the valley's definition of success, acquisition, dominance, the triumph of the individual. Alara looked from Blackwood's slick, confident face to Croft's cracked and dusty one. She thought of Anya's words. 100 different flowers. A promise that keeps. What kind of promise was Blackwood offering? It was the promise of a single crop, the crop of profit, as vulnerable as any field of clover. It was a promise easily broken. She finally turned her eyes to Jedediah Croft. I don't rent my bees for cash, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Croft's face fell. Blackwood smiled. It was not. I rent them for a share, Alara continued. A quarter of the squash harvest, if there is one. If the bees fail or the squash dies, you owe me nothing. Croft stared at her. He couldn't have heard right. It was a deal of impossible generosity. It was an act of grace. That's more than fair, he stammered. Then we have an agreement, Alara said. She turned to Blackwood, her gaze level and cool. As for your offer, Mr. Blackwood, my honey is not for sale to you. Not at any price. Blackwood's face went rigid, the mask of false warmth dropping to reveal the cold fury beneath. You're a fool, he hissed. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're choosing to give it away to the very people who laughed at you. I'm choosing to feed my neighbors, Alara said simply. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Croft and I have hives to move. She walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the dust, his carriage and his money suddenly looking cheap and powerless. He had misread her completely. He thought her weakness was that she was a woman alone. He failed to understand her strength was that she refused to act like one. Word of her deal with Jedediah Croft spread through the valley like a brush fire. It was a piece of news so contrary to the laws of drought and desperation that at first, no one believed it. But then Croft himself, a man not given to public pronouncements, told the story at the general store, his voice thick with a new, humbled respect. Soon, a trickle of other farmers made the pilgrimage up the hill to Alara's farm. A woman whose melon patch was failing. A man with a late planting of beans. Each one came with their hat in their hands, expecting to be turned away or charged a fortune. And to each, Alara made the same offer. A share of the harvest, if there was one. No cash up front. A risk shared. It was a form of currency the valley had almost forgotten. Trust. Then the townsfolk began to come. Not the farmers, but the families. The mothers who had no sugar for their children's oatmeal. The old people who craved a little sweetness in a bitter time. They came for honey. They came expecting to be rationed, to pay exorbitant prices for a small jar of the valley's only remaining luxury. On the day she decided to sell, a small crowd gathered in her yard. Silas Blackwood was there, too, standing by his carriage at the edge of the crowd, a vulture waiting to see the kill. He was certain she would crack, that the sight of all that need would tempt her into naming a high price. He was there to watch her become him. Finn stood beside Alara on the porch, a makeshift table in front of them laden with jars of honey, gleaming like jewels in the harsh sunlight. He looked nervous but proud, the self-appointed chancellor of this small, thriving kingdom. Alara stepped forward. The yard fell silent. I have honey to sell, she said, her voice carrying easily in the still air. The price is the same as it was last month. Before the drought got bad, a murmur went through the crowd. It was a fair price. A good price. It was not a drought price. From the edge of the crowd, Blackwood called out, his voice laced with scorn. Don't be a fool, girl. They'll buy it all, and you'll have nothing left. Sell it to me. I'll pay you double what they can, right now in cash. He held up a leather satchel. The crowd stirred, their loyalty torn between their need and their neighbor. This was the final test. Greed versus generosity, played out for the whole town to see. Alara looked past Blackwood, her eyes meeting the faces in the crowd. She saw the worry, the exhaustion, the hope. These were the people who had mocked her, yes. But they were also the people Finn would grow up with, the people Anya called neighbors. There is enough, Alara said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. 1 jar per family for now, so everyone gets some. My price is my price. Then a voice came from the crowd. It was Jedediah Croft. And if Blackwood tries to stop it, he said, stepping forward to stand near the porch, he'll have to go through me. Another farmer stepped up beside him. Then the woman with the melon patch. One by one, a line of farmers formed, a silent, dusty bulwark between Clara and Blackwood. They were flanking her, protecting their own chance at survival, and something more, a principle. Blackwood looked at the line of determined faces, at the woman on the porch who refused to break, and he knew he was beaten. His currency was worthless here. With a curse, he climbed back into his carriage and rode away, defeated not by a rival businessman, but by a community that had just remembered how to be one. Clara began to sell her honey, jar by jar, into the hands of her neighbors. The drought broke in late September, not with a gentle shower, but with a furious, cleansing deluge that turned the dusty lanes to mud and filled the air with the glorious smell of wet earth. The valley drank it in, and a collective sigh of relief seemed to rise from the land itself. The late-season crops, the ones pollinated by Clara's bees, produced a modest but vital harvest. The clean, scrape-bare look was no longer a mark of pride. Patches of color began to appear in the orderly green, small pockets of resilience planted in the margins. The town of Promise was learning the lesson the drought had taught. Diversity was not chaos, but strength. Clara's farm was thriving. The order from the baker at the Grand Excelsior had been doubled. Other chefs from other cities wrote her letters, asking for her unique, wild honey. She had more work than one person could handle. But she was no longer one person. Finn was a permanent fixture, his official title, by his own invention, being keeper of the queens. He knew every hive, every queen's name, and had a startlingly accurate sense of their moods. Clara began teaching him the business, the arithmetic not just of survival, but of prosperity. She hired 2 more women from the town to help with the bottling and wax rendering. She was not just a farmer, she was an employer. She was no longer the weed witch on the hill. She was Clara, the bee woman, a respected and integral part of the community she had fed. One warm afternoon, she sat on the porch with Anya Petrova, watching the bees traffic in and out of the hives. The air hummed with the sound of a million tiny promises being made and kept. Anya, her face deeply wrinkled by sun and time, nodded toward the fields below, where a strip of purple aster now bloomed along Croft's property line. 100 different flowers, Anya said, her voice soft. Clara smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. A promise that keeps. She looked out at her land, at the chaotic, beautiful, life-giving tapestry she had woven from scorned seeds and stubborn labor. She had been a woman alone, but she had cultivated not just flowers, but community. She had learned that the truest victory was not in being proven right, but in having the grace to share the spoils of that rightness. The land had tested her, the town had mocked her, and a greedy man had tried to break her. But she had held fast to a simple, wild truth, and in the end, her harvest was not just honey in a jar, but a future for the entire valley, a future humming with life, rooted in resilience, and blooming in the most unexpected places.